How's it going, ladies and Bruce's up? I'll be Sixkilla. Welcome back to Sekimeiya. We traveled back in time once again. We are heading back to the cleaning room where we traveled from to see what we're going to find there. It looks like we've gone back for an hour. Looks like an hour. So, although we did spend 50 minutes just hanging out, so hopefully we'll find where the Sekimeiya is hidden there, and also whatever else might have been with it in the cleaning room, because apparently Shiroya saw something. We walked up to the door, which hadn't been fully closed. As soon as we opened it, we instantly noticed the drastic change the room had undergone. What the fuck? The cleaning cart that had previously been there was nowhere to be seen. I recalled that it had been in the corner of the small room. Aside from its disappearance, I didn't think anything else had changed. Did someone take it with the Sekimeiya inside? No, I don't think so. No? Of course, that should have been my first thought, but there was an inconsistency. I looked at the cleaning cart a few times before. Underneath and around it, there had been 3 buckets storing scourers and chemicals like bleach. Those hadn't moved. These 3 buckets? One was under the cart, right? I think so. They must have put it under there because there's not a lot more space here, but if you tried to move the cart, you'd hit it in the other 2. First they need to be taken out, and then the cart could move. Oh, yeah, I guess so. I can't say for sure that nobody moved them, but if they had, it would have been really odd for them to put them back in the exact same spots. I suppose nobody would get the cart out anyway, which means that the cart disappeared too, right? And only the cart, not the buckets underneath it. In other words, what you were touching. This means that we're past the time we travelled from. Are you serious? That can't be it, since when you travelled for the first time, you were touching the cabinet. How come it didn't disappear? That's true. I supported my body on it with my left hand, so I was touching the cabinet. That's strange. If this cart disappeared when we travelled, did it appear somewhere else? Shiroya leaned forward with a frown. She was looking inside the buckets. Wait, it's here, look! Inside this one. Adopting a similar frown, I walked ahead to see what was inside. I saw it immediately. The Sekimeiya. It was inside the bucket that had been under the cart. On top of a pack of sponges. It was white, indicating that it had powered on already. Why is it here now? I believe this actually makes sense. Maybe you're right. If our travel made the cleaning cart disappear, the Sekimeiya being inside it would have fallen out in here. But why is it still here? Did nobody enter this room? They must not have. Well, what do we do with it? I thought for a few seconds. We'd lived a portion of our recent past from up to 3 perspectives. There was no need to immediately touch it again unless we need to figure out what had happened after we travelled. Let me do what Sai did earlier and try to avoid travelling. We should investigate before we think about activating it. Okay. I hid my hand under my sleeve and kneeled to grab the Sekimeiya. I touched it with my shirt and nothing around me had changed. As I stood back up while holding it, I noticed something was wrong. Wait, it's not hot at all. Earlier when Sai did this, the Sekimeiya felt really hot for him. He even touched me with the sleeve. Now though, it's actually cold. So it won't do anything right now. I wanted to test it, and I got close to Shiroya so that if it worked, the range would encompass her too. Perhaps it was a bad idea since nothing assured us we'd appear together, but it was better to try it like that. Without overthinking it, I placed my entire left hand on top of the Sekimeiya. After a full second, nothing had happened. Yeah, it doesn't work. That's strange. Can you think of why? Not at all. At least not if it stays consistent with the previous events. If the mechanics are completely random, it can just be that it takes a random amount of time until it starts to get hot. However, minutes after the Sekimeiya that Sai had in his pack turned white, it was already really hot. I don't get it then. It's very confusing, yeah. Maybe they're the 2 different ones and one has different mechanics to the other. Or maybe that's why Akado said he was only transported, not time travel. Maybe one of them only does physical transportation and the other one does time travel. I don't know. You know, a lot of strange things are happening. That's become very clear. Someone around us is the culprit that's behind this whole thing. We put it in this main cabinet a few times, but they keep getting it out. We last saw the cabinet key in the attic, but we won't go back up just to see if it's still there. We should try to understand how it works. I think working on that is better than just putting it back where it came from. So what do you want to do? This time, let's be the ones to hide it. Later we'll be able to see if anything's changed and hopefully understand better how it functions. We have a chance since, for some reason, nobody appears to be here. Are you sure? The cameras are still recording, and we've repeated a few times that every place where you can hide it is somewhere someone will eventually look. Regarding the cameras, I'm not sure we should worry. The culprit has been recorded plenty of times, and we'll be able to justify our actions, if that ever becomes necessary. When it comes to hiding spots, I can think of a couple. times we were trying to find the Sekimeiya, we only really looked through this floor, but I believe every spot in the attic would also be easy to find. So I have 2 suggestions. One is inside a computer tower. I saw screwdrivers in the attic. If we opened up a computer tower and hid the Sekimeiya inside, it's hard to think anyone would easily find it. It requires thinking about and unscrewing every other tower until you find it. That'd be a bit of a hassle for us though, so here's my better option. A locker. I thought of it earlier, you could just leave the screws undone in the tower, right, and just put the cover back on, and clip it in. No one's going to notice that there's no screws in it, and then it'd be easy to be accessible if you wanted to. I thought of it earlier, the last key in Naomi's keyring. It likely belonged to her locker, given that every staff member has one, and the size of the key seemed appropriate for it. Wouldn't Katai have recognized it? Yes, just like how he should have recognized the attics. We could try it. I thought that maybe Shiroya would be more hesitant, and I'd be ready to abandon the idea, but she didn't oppose it. Given the purpose was to further understand the Sekimeiya, it was likely she was also hopelessly thinking about using it to rewrite our recent days. With such a thought in mind, it was the first time we'd felt the countdown ticking along. The exit was presumably going to be unlocked in fewer than 8 hours, although our hours are very long considering we keep reliving the same one over and over again. And if we get hungry while we're doing that, we're going to die of starvation before we get out in 12 hours. And we still had to look at what time it was. We only had those hours to understand what the rules were, and if they'd ever been useful to us. However, the voice recorder kept haunting us. We'd found something that implied that we'd be there for a whole month. At this rate, we will be. It was funny that for the first time, that sounded very slightly desirable, as it would have given us more time to comprehend what was going on and how to use the Sekimeiya. Someone could have wanted to trap us for a month just to accomplish that, but I couldn't begin to imagine how the rest of the plan would unfold in that case. At the same time, the exit was going to open at some point, and the Sekimeiya would be exposed to the world. Supposedly, it had been found 2 weeks prior in a nearby mountain. It was hard to believe nobody had experienced its supernatural powers, but as I thought that, I recalled that I was also holding it in my hands without a single effect resulting from it. We entered B4, the room with the first Naomi. I remembered where the keys were, so I found them easily. 2 keys remained, a small one I wanted, and one for the door in the first staircase. I took the smaller one off the keyring, otherwise it was too large to keep on my person, and it might have made noise. Then we walked off to the staff room. I inserted the key into the locker, and once again, I'd been correct about the purpose of the key. I'm pretty sure it'll work. It's not for this locker, so let me find the right one. I inserted the key into another locker and attempted to turn it, to no avail. Then I repeated the process with the others until one opened. Good, it's this one. I opened the big door. 2 compartments are inside, a small and empty one on top, and the bigger main one that had Naomi's coat hung inside it. I placed the Sekimeiya in the smaller one and took the coat out. I felt through the pockets, but they were all empty inside, aside from a single handkerchief that I left alone. I put the coat back inside. It was a bit disappointing that we hadn't found anything substantial, but I hadn't expected to. I closed the door and locked it with the key, while Shiroya observed all my actions from the side. That's it then. At least there are no security cameras here, so we won't be seen hiding it. I know, that's good. By the way, regarding the cart disappearing, I think it makes more sense than not. What's really strange is that nobody seems to have noticed the fallen Sekimeiya. For example, when I touched the Sekimeiya, why did I teleport but not the cabinet? And why did my clothes teleport? I was stepping on my shoes, so they teleported. My shoes were stepping on the floor though, so why didn't the floor teleport? It's probably just because my clothes were under my possession, while the floor wasn't. How can a rock tell ownership laws, you know what I mean? How does that work? Similarly, the cabinet I wasn't touching wasn't under my possession, but the cart was under yours. It's very interesting, as the cart is designed to be moved by whoever is holding it, while the cabinets aren't. That's why the simple act of touching the cart makes it to be under your possession, but touching a cabinet on the floor isn't enough. Rocks can't discern ownership, you know? It's a rock. It's not... I mean, presumably this is meant to assume that it's a sort of sci-fi thing, right? Like it's got this kind of power. It's not magic, right? It can't just... Maybe the rock is sentient? I don't fucking know, but it seems pretty unlikely, right? That's about what I imagined, but that means that somehow the Sekimeiya recognized that the cat was movable and the cabinet wasn't. Yeah, exactly, which is convenient for us, or else we could have made many more things disappear just because we were making contact with them. Remember the suitcase in the attic? Something similar must have happened. Naomi travelled holding it, so it travelled along too. We didn't find it strange at all, since it's natural to imagine that it had happened, but your purse has travelled both times when it was only touching your clothes, It has to be because it recognises being a part of your whole entity when you travel. But we didn't appear upstairs with the cart while I had my purse. Right, if the cart actually appeared somewhere else, that would indicate again that the location where we appear isn't determined by where we are when we touch the Sekimeiya, or else it would have appeared with us. Her purse appeared with us. So maybe it thinks that the cart is another person. I don't fucking know. So if the cart has appeared somewhere, the position must be determined by where the cart was at another point in time. And it should be easy to draw conclusions from that, because it spent the entire time in the cleaning room. I think so. Finally, consider this as well. When the cart travelled, everything that formed the cleaning cart disappeared alongside it. That included the bag covering its interior and the cleaning products that were placed at the front of it. All of that disappeared, as it was considered a single element you were holding. That's why it's notable that the Sekimeiya didn't disappear while it was also part of the cart. It was inside it, so it should have been part of what you were touching with your other hand. However, it remained in place and fell in the bucket that was underneath it, which didn't teleport as it wasn't attached to the cart. So as we thought, the Sekimeiya can't go along with us. Pretty much, even though it's what allows you to travel in the first place, it should have been part of what was determined as in your possession. That wasn't necessarily the case in previous travels. I wasn't holding the cabinets in the same sense. The Sekimeiya must exclude itself when it comes to what it makes travel, and lastly, even if it had travelled, it's unlikely we would have appeared with it. Which is what I suspect would happen with the Sekimeiya in size hip pack. Since the cart didn't appear with us in the attic, the Sekimeiya probably wouldn't have either. I guess you're right, this clears a few things up. We should probably try to get an idea of what happened here though. Yeah, the others should still be around. I imagine they'd look at them, at the place we disappeared from, so I have no idea why the Sekimeiya was still there. Let's go find them. Maybe you have to visit the lawyer with the Sekimeiya so that you can show it a contract with, you know, legally defined fucking ownership laws. And then it'll be able to teleport. We'll be moving through hallway B for a few minutes, so it seemed appropriate to begin there. It was unlikely anyone had been near us, but we weren't going to lose much time by making sure to glance at every room. The start was at the two bathrooms, and aside from Naomi's body, they were empty. There, in a rapid manner, we began to open every door to see if anything could easily spot what was around us. The Sekimeiya's cabinet, as expected, was empty. The original Naomi was still partially under a curtain after I grabbed her key, so I covered her properly again. The last crystal rooms were as they'd been from the start. To go the opposite hallway, we went to the lobby, knowing that the mechanical room was also on our way. Unexpectedly, our search came to an abrupt stop when we stepped into a large hall. People were next to the metallic shutter. We recognized them immediately. Edina, Arkudo, and Katai were kneeling down next to the wall, while Sai looked at them from above. As soon as we opened the door, their heads lifted to meet our gazes. After a couple of quiet seconds, Katai was the first to further acknowledge our presence and stood up from the floor. He began walking toward us, and we did the same until we met in the middle of the room. Where were you? What the hell happened earlier? While the conversation started, we walked to the others who had kept silent. Strangely, they were looking down again, wearing unsettling expressions. You mean when Sai sneaked away? Right, we disappeared. The Sekimeiya made us go to the past again, and this time we appeared in the attic. Oh, I see. After his strangely short response, we went over to the shutter. Something might have happened as everyone else appeared quiet and unresponsive. I wonder why they've decided to stay there too. Did you search for us at all? Since that wasn't a question directed at anyone in particular, Sai decided to speak. You were in the attic, he said. Why didn't you come down sooner? We fell asleep and lost track of time. Did something happen? Where's Isla? I asked it instinctively, but I hadn't consciously realized that Isla wasn't with them. Edina, who I'd imagined would quickly answer, remained looking down at her lap, hiding her face from us. Strain filled my body, as the mere action made me imagine that something very bad could have happened. None of the others decided to respond either, and instead shut their eyes before lowering their heads. Finally, I noticed that their expression was tinged with sorrow. They understood that their own reactions had started to fill us in. After a few unsettling seconds, Sai began speaking in a faint voice, uncharacteristic of the way he'd come across at any other time. Shiroya and I, along with the others who lay against the wall, listened to the words that narrated what had taken place while we were sleeping 6 floors above. Isla can't die, she's a little kid. Come on now. Whose voice is that? That's an O. At the same time that Shiroya and Atsuki disappeared from the cleaning room, Edina and Isla, who was in the opposite hallway, saw Sai appearing from hallway C. As soon as they made eye contact, Sai's body visibly relaxed, as if he changed personalities in an instant. He began slowly walking toward the two girls next to the event room. who hadn't said anything yet. Without a care in the world, he was the first to ask a question. What's going on? Where'd the others go? What? They went to find you since you disappeared all of a sudden. Why'd you do that? Naturally, Editor didn't know how to react, given the others had made it seem essential to guard Hallway A in case Sai went there before they could get him. What do you mean? We were going to start searching for the Sekimeiya, so I just went ahead first. What? Why didn't you tell us then? Didn't you go to Hallway B? Yes, but I just headed over here since it's a better place to start with. I was going to tell you two to come, but you were looking at me weird, so I wasn't sure if anything happened. Those were very convincing words, but Editor didn't question him further, mostly because Sai's own question cut in. Where are the others? Peeking inside the event room with a frown, Sai noticed the lack of other people. They went behind you, didn't I say it? They were in Hallway B. The door to the opposite hallway was open and Arcado could be seen with his own frown, evidently ignoring the sound of their conversation. Sai said Arcado's name out loud, and a few seconds later, his head finally turned to face them. Upon asking him what had caused the strange face of his, he let them know that Shiroya and Atsuki had not yet left the cleaning room. Sai, showing the strongest reaction, approached the room while letting out a conspicuous thinking sound. He opened the door and stayed still for some time. Then he entered the small space before the others had time to wonder what he was doing. He exited and told them that it was empty. Arcado, who had a hard time believing it, stepped forward and became aware of the glaring contradiction within the room. Seeing his dumbfounded face, Edna and Isla got closer too. The four of them saw that not only had Shiroya and Atsuki vanished from the room, but that the cleaning cart had too. A disappearing cart was nothing compared to everything that had already happened. Once the other three stepped in, they became aware of the cause. The Sekimeiya sat inside one of the few buckets that had remained on the floor of the little room. It was Sai who first questioned its status. It somewhat contradicted a few things they'd concluded earlier. It was white instead of the grey colour they thought it would become, after having teleported two people in a whole cleaning cart. Not much discussion was had. Up until then, they'd grown accustomed to Katai's voice immediately instructing them to put the Sekimeiya back in the cabinet. It was the lack of those words that alerted them that Katai wasn't there. Where's Katai? He followed you to Hallway C. Me. Then why did he come to the event room when we were in Hallway A? Doubtful looks were the only answers. Sai, Edna and Isla had spent a few seconds talking next to its door. Of course, Katai should have been seen. Taking advantage of Katai's absence, they removed their full focus from the Sekimeiya and left it where they found it, prioritizing finding him. All of them assumed that attempting to find Shiroya and Atsuki was futile, as they'd most likely teleported through time and were somewhere else entirely. Sai was the first to suggest going to see where Katai had gone, which shouldn't have taken a long time. With Arcado in front and Sai in the back, the four left the room and saw the empty Hallway C. The stairs presented the possibility of Katai having gone upward, but Hallway A was the most likely option. Shiroya and Atsuki should still be here, even if they travel back in time. It could be that Katai took advantage of the situation to do something. Sai called out Katai's name, while Arcado viewed the entire situation with suspicion. As he'd seen, Sai in front of the cleaning room, where the Sekimeiya turned out to be. He asked Sai why he'd disappeared earlier, which was answered the same way he justified his actions to Edna. They stopped in front of the stairs, and Sai sighed. Sai sighed as soon as he saw the other long, empty hallway. You all rushed too quickly to find me when I was only trying to move things along, and now this happened. We found the Sekimeiya already at least, but now we have to search for 3 people, which is just great. Sai began directing the others. With Atsuki and Katai gone, his demands met no resistance. You can't bitch that we followed him because he just pissed off and did his own thing. And now he's complaining because everybody else did the same. His arrangement consisted of Edna and Isla staying next to the stairs and Arcado checking Hallway B, while he himself looked through the Hallway A rooms. That way the search wouldn't take more than 2 minutes. As they put that into practice, Sai continued yelling out Katai's name. He wasn't being drawn to the noise, so it followed that he wasn't nearby. Drawing a zigzag pattern, Arcado and Sai met in the lobby, after looking through every room in their respective hallways. In the meantime, Isla observed next to her mother. Despite her initial optimism, she was aware of what the situation had become. Sai put an end to the search by deeming the mechanical room empty. They walked back to the starting point where Edna and Isla were waiting. One of the 4 of them knew that they were the only people on that floor. Once the 4 of them knew they were the only people on the floor, they wondered where Katai had gone off to. With a free way to the other floors, he could have been anywhere. And even though they'd quickly accepted that Shiroya and Atsuki had once again travelled through time, they should have shown up by that point. Atsuki and Shiroya's actions weren't openly questioned. After all, everyone had assumed they'd found the Sekimeiya and touched it without negative intentions. After Arcado had revealed that Sai had been out about to enter the cleaning room, Edna couldn't help but suspect that they were being shamelessly manipulated. She sat on the stairs. She was tired and had to bear the constant thought of having brought her daughter into danger. They were locked up in a huge building with a murderer, and the people she wanted to trust had accepted that time travel was an ongoing factor they'd used to explain mysteries pressing down on them. Mentally, she was exhausted. Ever since the first time they'd found Naomi's body, she had been especially careful not to let Isla out of her sight or go off with anyone else. She simply couldn't fully trust him. From fighting Naomi's second body onward, it was irrefutable that something unnatural was happening, but her only priority was her daughter's safety. Isla had initially been eager to go to what was supposed to be a routine event, but had turned into something incomprehensible. Edna couldn't imagine that someone would want to harm her, but the risk of being there had all gradually eroded any confidence that she had in that notion. She only wanted to show that she needed a short break before the search that seemed to follow. Her own daughter, though, didn't grasp that intention, and she suddenly walked off toward hallway A while the others stared at her curiously. Sweetie, where are you going? With a distressed and concerned voice, Edna let out those words. Looking up from the stairs, Isla turned around and saw her mother's face, and she found it a little hard to decipher. Choosing to answer the question with her own actions, she continued walking and stopping next to room A5. It was the place where the gemstones had been stolen, the sole crystal room exposed to the smoke. Isla reached up to grab the doorknob and turned it to open her way in. From the stairs, 3 people looked at her, finding what they were seeing very odd. As soon as they saw Isla enter the room, Edna gave up on her brief rest and stood up. While she approached the room, she timidly called Isla's name. Once she was by the door, the 2 men behind started to approach her, intrigued by Isla's behaviour. Isla had left the door open, so Edna was the first to see inside the room. As she remembered, it was dirty by a dark colour and was very light, very little light went through the coating of the ceiling. The light leaking in from hallway C was the main source of illumination. It took her a second to spot Isla amidst the obscurity. She was putting all her force she could into opening a cabinet, unbeknownst to Edna. What would then occur would not leave her memories until they all faded away. Applying force with her 2 small arms, Isla lifted up the very heavy cover of the cabinet, found deep in the room. To prevent it from closing, she leaned it on the wall. After that, she attempted to peek inside, but her short body didn't make it easy. With both hands, she grabbed the top of the cabinet and propelled herself upwards to see inside it. Once her eyes made contact with what lay within the compartment she'd uncovered, a nightmarish scream tore through the room, terrifying Edna while she looked in from the hallway. But that was only half of what she had to witness. Isla's face was hidden in the cabinet, so Edna was unable to see that confident look and shifted into an agonizing expression. Edna's mind reeled in response, and she began running to aid her daughter. She wondered what the cause of such a horrible scream could have been. Had it been physical pain or a reaction to something she'd seen? As Edna rushed inside, Isla's instincts told her to get out of the position she put herself in. However, due to her jump, the front of the cabinet had suspended her in midair, painfully pressing into her stomach and not letting her legs reach the floor. The only way she could move was by leaning forward. Man, this track is fucking dope as. Next to the door, Edna's senses all perceived the same thing. Isla, in her helpless state, inclined forward and fell inside the cabinet. Only the sound of her body was heard, as no yell came out. Like the curtain falling after a play, the impact made the lid fall, shaking out of its precarious balance. Edna let out a cry and ran as fast as she could. Meanwhile, Sai and Akuto looked on from the door. When Edna reopened the lid and leaned in, she finally saw what the ominous cabinet contained. Nothing. Edna didn't see anything but the 5 faces of the cabinet, covered by a velvet texture that, while untainted by the smoke, appeared black due to the lack of light. She stood still while her heart sped up. Then she snapped and began to feel its walls, trying to understand how the cabinet had swallowed up her daughter. Unable to find anything, she desperately looked around the cabinet in case she'd misinterpreted what had happened. Akuto and Sai, however, both bewildered, had just arrived in time to corroborate that Isla's lower body had fallen inside. They stepped in while Edna's next reaction was to open up the adjacent cabinets in the hope of a hidden connection. Within all of them, the only contents were a handful of gems. As the wordless commotion continued, Sai moved toward the cabinet Isla had fallen into. He looked inside it for a few seconds, and verified with his own eyes that there was nobody inside, just as Edna had done. He couldn't suppress the need to reach in, attempting to find a hidden passageway. He felt the entire interior, and once he was done, he stood back up to gesture at Akuto, and Edna was right. There was nothing there. They turned to Edna, who had gone completely immobile. Every cabinet had been opened and closed, and she was leaning against the last one without the strength to look up. Before the others had to wait, she spoke with a nearly broken voice. Where did she go? She couldn't have disappeared. In these circumstances, that normally sensible claim had no basis. Of course, she could have disappeared. As such a thing had already happened multiple times, the real question they had to ask themselves was how. Sai and Arcado knew that, but they didn't reply, unable to find appropriate words. Tell me, something must have happened to her. And this has to do with this, teleportation you two keep talking about. What happened? They'd realised that the room was empty. Isla had suddenly disappeared without leaving a trace. Even though disappearances had become commonplace, they thought that the Sekimeiya had to be directly involved for one to occur. Despite that, they'd found it in the cleaning room and left it there. Furthermore, Atsuki's earlier explanation of the range emitted by the Sekimeiya couldn't explain what had occurred when nobody else nearby had disappeared along with Isla. And even though it seemed of less importance, there was one last thing without an explanation. Isla's scream. She let out a terrifying cry as soon as she looked inside the cabinet. However, Edina had immediately looked inside and seen nothing. Sai and Arcado told all of that to Edina, who until that point hadn't fully considered the full implications of the paranormal events she'd witnessed. They wanted to reassure Edina that even though Isla had somehow disappeared, she'd gone to the past and was safe somewhere else. Edina knew that what had happened couldn't be immediately answered, so she rushed out to find Isla, hoping they would reunite soon. They had a whole building to search through, and no guarantee that Isla was still in it. At the same time, a part of Edina was still trying to understand why Isla had suddenly walked to that cabinet. She tried to comfort herself when she remembered that recording that she heard in the attic, since in the worst case scenario it told her that Isla was going to be safe in a month. For the first time, Edina viewed it as a failsafe instead of one of the worst possibilities. Only 3 people were part of the group that still remained on the crystal floor. They wanted to urgently find Isla, whose vanishing had suddenly generated the first real instance of chaos since the start of their imprisonment. They confirmed that the Sekimeiya hadn't moved from the cleaning room, and their rushed search began. They kept yelling Isla's name, hoping that she would appear before them. Even though a single disappearance hadn't yet been linked to direct danger, Edina was very clearly nervous, which was why she went through the whole building as fast as they could. Having recently looked through the entire bottom floor, they were done with it swiftly. The elevator should have still been disabled in the attic, so their search continued through the stairs. Emitting clear desperation, they hastily looked through the rest of the building, yelling for Isla. Once they finished, the result took a bit of time to sink in. Not only had they not found Isla, but Katai, Shiroya, and Atsuki hadn't been drawn into their yells either. As they thought, the elevator was still open, and they chose not to re-enable it yet. With a much slower pace and devoid of energy, they headed downstairs, surrounded by the haunting silence. Edina's thoughts kept going back to the recording, which she could no longer make Sai and Arcado listen to, even if she wanted to. As it had happened, it had disappeared along with Isla's purse. The crystal floor was just as empty as before. None of them knew what to do, so they lethargically walked to the lobby. Before them was the immutable shutter, preventing them from escaping and obtaining help. Edina leaned against it while the other two stayed still, imagining how Edina was suffering, being faced with the precarious disappearance of her child they had chosen long ago not to say anything unnecessary. For a while they stayed there powerless against the confusing reality, hoping that waiting would lead them somewhere. They knew where the Sekimeiya was, but without Katai, dealing with it seemed far from their priority. It appeared impossible that it had been related to Isla's disappearance, but no other explanation existed. Out of the blue, they found themselves alone, in a huge building with 2 identical corpses after 4 people had vanished. The silence had not yet been interrupted since they had set foot on the crystal floor, but the 3 of them had been thinking about drastically different things. It was an outside sound that finally breached the empty air coming from hallway A. They immediately lifted their heads. The door had been left open, so they all rushed to see if they could spot the origin of the sound. They did so easily. Katai's figure was in the middle of the wide floor, his shoulders slumped. As soon as they saw each other, Katai rushed to them. "Where'd you go? We searched for you." Sai shot the first question, and an immediate answer came that the 3 of them left the 3 of them unsatisfied. "I don't know. I think I experienced what Atsuki said, that teleportation. I've been searching for you." The brief explanation was all they got, as the next thing that came out of his mouth was the question they'd known would come. Where are Isla, Atsuki, and Shiroya? Katai looked through the door and saw the empty hall. 3 faces lowered in front of him, communicating what had occurred. Arcado, knowing how hard it was for Edina to hear those words, chose to speak and briefly explain the recent events. There was a lot of information to take in for Katai, and only made everything that had recently happened even more confusing. Despite that, he had few thoughts that he chose to keep to himself. I see. I'm sorry, but I have no clue what happened to any of us. You said you searched the building, right? The others nodded. They told them where Isla, Atsuki, and Shiroya had disappeared from, so he began walking to where they'd last seen Isla. And that part of the story was what he least understood. They all entered room A5 and were hit by the memory of Isla's body falling into that looming void. They lowered every lid before leaving, so Sai pointed at a specific one. Katai approached it, finding it hard to believe that nothing had been found inside. He completely denied the thought of any opening or passage within the cabinet, so he wanted to see if he could truly get a good idea of what had happened, or if he could reinforce what he believed had truly occurred. He gripped the lower part of the lid with his right arm and lifted it. As soon as the smallest gap appeared, he peeked inside. Even though there was very little light, he frowned. As he continued uncovering the cabinet, that frown shifted into a much darker expression. Once he was done, he could only gesture at the others to see with his own eyes, as he couldn't bring himself to say the words out loud. Hearing his faint but trembling voice, Edina rushed to see what he'd seen. When she saw the body of her daughter lying face up, her mind broke, and all of her thoughts were defied. Issa almost looked like she was sleeping, but the lack of her chest rising made Edina fear the worst. Without thinking, she reached inside, and as soon as she found Isla's skin, she gave out and collapsed into the cabinet, creating a slight reminiscence of the last time Isla had been seen. She felt no trace of life, only a cold piece of flesh with a texture far from the one she recognised as her daughter's. While the others stared with pity, Edina didn't move, her sharp cries piercing the air. The recording, which she had begun to see as proof of hope, had become an impossibility. After some time, Katai looked inside the cabinet again, while everyone kept an eye on him. He didn't see anything else. Isla rested alone in the space she disappeared from. The others knew how heartless it was to attempt to solve what had happened right away, but nobody could help but think about how little sense it all made. Isla had disappeared from an empty cabinet to reappear inside it later. The only changes, her status from alive to dead. A third death had surfaced, and that time, someone who'd been with the group from the start had been the victim. It wasn't a third Naomi? My god, shocking. Once again, a number of questions came along with it, but no answers, not even the cause of death. Regardless, the unfortunate reality was that a mother had lost her child on what should have been an enjoyable day that had morphed into an inexplicable nightmare. The rest of them verified that Isla was no longer alive. And while they were hit hard by such a tragedy, they knew they couldn't begin to imagine what Edina was feeling. They exchanged looks without interfering with her body trembling as she hit her face. Eventually she stood up abruptly and dashed out of the room, briefly displaying her tormented expression. Edina had left due to her recollection of Naomi's death. A killer was nearby and had managed to remain unseen. Even though she couldn't begin to take in what had happened, she understood that her life had warped into something terrible, regret, her only companion. She took advantage of her last amount of strength that she had within herself and used it, while her adrenaline still led her. Frantically, she opened every door of the hallway, then she looked through every cabinet in case the killer had brazenly hidden in one. Her thoughts on the matter were clear, and she knew who to suspect. Katai, Atsuki, and Shiroya could have all been responsible in some way. However, as soon as she entered the huge and overwhelming lobby, her body gave out under the full weight of her daughter's death. She wouldn't have been able to find her killer, and most likely, she would never begin to understand what had happened to her. Suffering from the most painful feeling of emptiness, she slumped on a wall and slowly slid to the ground. Sai, Arcado, and Katai, upon noticing that sound of Edina's movements had abruptly faded, walked to the lobby to see her sitting on the floor ahead. They approached her slowly and remained at her side. A loud noise resounded through the entire floor as they understood what it had been. The cabinet's lid had fallen when nobody had been looking, sealing Isla inside while also letting her rest peacefully. Nobody chose to leave the lobby. They knew the gravity, a simple law of the universe, had closed Isla's coffin by itself. However, they didn't know the true consequences that sound had brought, and spent the time unaware until hallway B's door opened. What consequences does it have? Okay, we're gonna wrap this one up, because we're out of time for this episode. Man, I feel like I couldn't read for shit during that episode. Apologies for that. Trip it all over my own words. I'm tired, you know? I'm tired. That's my excuse. Sleepy time. But, yeah. Shit. The kid died? That's not cool, bro. That's not cool at all. I don't like that. I don't like that. Yeah. Yeah, I don't like that. Yeah. Once it... Alright, alright. Well, hopefully something will fix that. We can still go back in time and undo that, right? Oh, we can't change the past, apparently. Not that we have any proof of that, but whatever. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Thanks again for being. I'll see you in the next one.